Hello and warmest greetings to you. Thank you for joining me. My name is Patrick Antwine, and I'm glad that you have chosen to follow along in this episode of Just a Few. In fact, I always wonder, who am I reaching? It's hard to tell with a medium like this. Maybe you can just, if you have never identified yourself before as a viewer, just go down in the comments and say, hi, I'm watching, or something very simple. The encouragement really helps. So, in these episodes, I take the opportunity to respond to a question submitted to me. Today's question was submitted by someone who came across a ritual in the book of Genesis and wanted some clarification on what exactly was happening in that ritual. So join me for my response now. The question is taken from a passage in the book of Genesis, chapter 24, and I'll read a couple verses there for you and then give my response very quickly. Genesis 24 verses 2 and 3 records when Abraham, being too old, being close to 100 years old, wanted to find, 100 and maybe 120 or so years old, because he was about to find a bride for his son Isaac, who was about to be married, wanted to become married. And he was too old, and he was going to send his servant to find a bride for Isaac. That's what's happening in Genesis 24. Verses 2 and 3 says, So Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, Please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. And so the question that comes out of that is, why did the servant of Abraham place his hands under Abraham's thigh? Interesting question and quite observant, and it means that the person who sent in this question wanted to get deeper into the text and understand what's happening here. The servant of Abraham eventually responded lower down in the chapter in verse 9, when the Bible says, So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. So he swore, he gave an oath while putting his hands under Abraham's thigh. What exactly was happening there? To understand what's happening here, and of course, as I did a bit of research, I found out that lots of the commentators who write Bible commentaries are not agreed on, they're not fully sure what all that was involved in that ancient ritual. But basically, there are two possibilities or two things that might have been happening there. It involves or revolves around the issue of circumcision, which was the sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. So I'll take you back to Genesis chapter 17 and read a few verses for you there. Verse 9 to verse 11 of Genesis 17. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you, between God and Abraham's descendants. By placing his hands under the thigh, he was bringing his hands close to Abraham's genital area, and he was making an oath by swearing by the God of Abraham, the God of the covenant, because the covenant involves circumcision of the male genitals. And so he was placing his hands as close as was morally acceptable in that culture to Abraham's genitals to say, I'm swearing by the God of the covenant that I know you have this covenant relationship with Jehovah God. So I think that there are two things that are being said here. The servant is saying by that oath and swearing both orally and by placing his hands in the area of Abraham's genitals. Remember, the genitals, of course, is the seat of your reproductive capability. And he was swearing by Abraham's offspring and the God who Abraham identified with in a covenant with a sign of circumcision. So the two things are, the servant was swearing by the God of Abraham and identifying with the Abrahamic covenant. the sign of which was male genital circumcision. That's why he placed his hands close to Abraham's genitals, where the sign of the covenant was endorsed, was with the circumcision of the male organs, sex organs. The second thing was the servant was binding himself to be under the wrath of Abraham's offspring should he not keep his promise to Abraham to find a suitable wife for Isaac. May your offspring do to my offspring what the covenant terms says as the wrath of God upon those who violate the covenant. That's what you're saying. It's not the only time we see this practice done. Later on, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, was an old man now, about to die. He had gone down with his family into Egypt. And before he died, he made his son Joseph swear in a similar manner that they will not allow Jacob's bones to remain in Egypt, will be buried in Egypt, but that they will take it back to Canaan to be buried there. And that's found in Genesis 47 from verse 29. It says, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. So he swore, but he made him do this additional ritual. Then he said, swear to me, and he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And Joseph followed that same practice. So it's an ancient practice. We don't see it after that anymore, but it was part of swearing a solemn oath by the God of the covenant and by the offspring of the ones that God has said he is in covenant relationship with, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's why that was practiced. My name is Patrick Antwine. Thank you for the question. Hope my answer shed some light on any areas that you may have a bit of uncertainty about with that practice. And if you have a question and would like to submit it to me, in addition to placing a comment, letting me know who you are, again, that'll be a source of encouragement to me. If you have a question, please use the email address for the questions so that I'll try to respond to you as soon as I can. Until the next time,